Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Tom. This is really a pleasure. I will say that, hello, Ambassador, how are you? We have a number of ambassadors here tonight. I entered the State Department in 2005 under Condi Rice. I was her Undersecretary for Economics and Energy, and the famed, we called them the Burns brothers. I don't know if you even know this, but Nicholas Burns and Bill Burns, and he is one of the most decent human beings. And when you enter a huge place like State and have to figure out very fast with an ambitious agenda, you played two very early roles for me that I don't know if you even remember. But I was the sous Sherpa for the G8 in St. Petersburg, which means you get to prepare all of the documents that are being negotiated, and you're back and forth probably every 6 weeks in Moscow. I remember it was 4 hours and 45 minutes. It was 15 minutes shorter than the upgrade to business class. And I remember taking all my negotiating documents in coach and trying to prepare because we never had preparation time. It was a long trip, but when you have an ambassador who organizes well and knows the touch points in a country, and we were negotiating everything from the last, petri of smallpox on Earth, which was there, and public health to the global economy and things like that. You're amazing. But also we had a kind of crisis in the relationship, which continues with Russia and the energy industry at the time. And I was back and forth trying to deal with that and figure that out. So I just want to say what an honor it is. You're an amazing human being, and there's a reason you're a legend at State, and when people enter, they say, you've got to spend time with you, so thank you.
Thanks. Well, it really is a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm a huge admirer of the Asia Society, a huge admirer of the wonderful person to my right, and thanks so much for the kind introduction, too.
Yeah, no, excellent. So I thought what we'd do, because this book's been out for a little while, it truly, to me, is the most accessible diplomatic book I've ever read. And it's on Audible, and I'm kind of addicted to Audible as a way to end my day every day, and just you bring to life history and things that, many of us have read about and lived through those moments. What I thought I'd do is I want to read a few moments that you have identified as brilliant moments during your tenure, and then a few moments you have, I think, identified as bad decisions. And I just thought we'd start with that, but then we have some pictures, and I think it's going to be fun to go a little bit through these moments in history, because of all the people that have interviewed you, I haven't quite gotten the full, history of your career at
the
State.
Scary part, yeah.
And I know we have Cynthia Whitehead here, but John Whitehead, you've intersected with some of our former chairs of this institution. John Whitehead, of course, was Deputy Secretary of State. Maybe we'll just start here with an incident with you being a young operative at the State Department and knocking over one of his priceless paintings.
Yeah, this was
in his
actually,
office.
I didn't get off to a rocket-propelled start as a diplomat. I was a pretty young diplomat. I must have been in 3 or 4 years in the Foreign Service. I entered in 1982, and John Whitehead had just become the Deputy Secretary of State, and so he usually had wonderful judgment, but in this one instance he hired me as one of his 2 special assistants, 2 young Foreign Service officers. So my first day on the job, I go walking into this office, which is quite ornate in the State Department, and he was a wonderful art collector and had one of the original Degas miniatures on the edge of his desk, or close to the edge of it. So I go in to put a file of papers in his inbox and manage to knock the Degas over. Fortunately, they're very thick Oriental rugs, and it just bounced. And I remember him just looking up like this. He was such a gentleman, and asking, do you have any idea how much that cost? So fortunately, he was very patient.
Yes. Here's an amazing chair here.
It got better after that.
And Richard Holbrook, of course, was chair here. We have Connie Martin here, and Liz Jennings, and Tom Pickering, and Frank Wisner, and John Negroponte, a lot of our other colleagues of yours. So moments of brilliance that you lived through, that you mention, is the dismantling of the Soviet Union, the German reunification, the Madrid Peace Conference, the first time you said under a structure and one idea that the Middle East came together to achieve something like that. the coalition for Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, which you called the most significant coalition for a war since World War II. You talked about good teams, and he talks a lot about how people make a difference in diplomacy. And I think any of the diplomats here who deal with the U.S. or any other country know it's often about those human relations that make a difference. But you very in particular dwell on the Bush 41 team, which had James Baker, Scowcroft, Cheney, Colin Powell, Schwarzkopf, Pickering, Eagleberger, Zellick, yourself, and others who really had an unprecedented degree of trust and communication, I think strategic shared vision on things. And then who was that? Was Pickering at UN then?
He was.
Because he was building that coalition. Any of those you want to pick on, or any that I left out that you'd like to highlight?
No, I mean, I was really fortunate over 35 years as a diplomat. I worked for 5 presidents and 10 secretaries of state survived me. And I learned from a lot of wonderful diplomats like Richard Holbrooke, just observing their skills over the years. But, if I had to pick a moment when I probably learned the most, it was that era, the George H.W. Bush administration. Jim Baker was the Secretary of State, Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. And what made that moment unique, in my view, is it was the intersection of a time of real transformation on the international landscape, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, lots of new challenges in the Middle East, intersecting with a group of statesmen, just as you said, who were quite skilled individually, but also functioned very well as a team. They had a sense of strategic purpose in the sense that they understood that this moment of uncontested American primacy wasn't going to last forever. And so their effort was to try to anchor American leverage in a set of relationships and alliances and institutions which would outlive that moment. They had a sense of strategic empathy, too, which I've always thought is important in diplomacy. It's not the same thing as sympathy, but it's an ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes. I watched as President Bush dealt with Mikhail Gorbachev, who's, not only was losing the Cold War, but his country was, collapsing around him. And you didn't see Bush or Baker dancing on the Berlin Wall or spiking the football either. And not least, they had a sense of strategic discipline in their capacity to actually follow through on strategies and smart choices. There's one brief Baker story about discipline. After Desert Storm and the expulsion of Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces from Kuwait, you'll remember that Baker then organized over almost 10 months the Madrid Peace Conference, so for the first time to bring Arabs and Israelis together around the same agenda. And most people were pretty skeptical that he could pull this off. To this day, outside his office in Houston, he has a whole wall full of cartoons, newspaper cartoons, most of which make fun of him. He was Don Quixote, tilting at windmills. But one of the most memorable meetings that he had when I was traveling on his trips as a very junior diplomat was one with Hafez al-Assad, the then bloody dictator of Syria, the father of the current bloody dictator of Syria in Damascus, which went on for 9 hours. It was the longest single meeting I had ever sat through. And what made it memorable in a way was that Hafez al-Assad had this really disconcerting habit of sitting in his chair motionless for hours on end, but drinking endless cups of sweet Arab tea. Baker, ever the competitive Texan, was determined not to move and to match him cup for cup. So 4 hours into the meeting, our then ambassador in Damascus, a really fine diplomat, cracked, comes over to Baker and says he's got an urgent phone call to make. Now, he had urgent business, but it was not a phone call. So Baker and Assad then spent the next 40 minutes, commiserating about bladder-challenged American diplomats. So it's a different form of discipline in diplomacy.
One thing that strikes me in the book is so much of diplomacy is preparation and hard work and understanding and really seeing where the openings are and how to connect the dots in new ways. But these things are maybe considered boring and not exciting these days or undervalued in a way. And so you talk about heads-down diplomacy.
Right.
Could you explain what you mean by that? And why would it be? Because, President Bush 41 would be a good example of someone who people saw as not a flashy president.
No.
But things like the reunification of Germany,
Right.
were those inevitable? Or,
No.
Was it the thousands of efforts that had to happen behind it and strategic thinking? And why do we undervalue that kind of systematic diplomacy?
Well, oftentimes it's easy to take it for granted because it involves a balance of a real kind of daring, an appreciation that there's an opportunity that requires some risk-taking, and also a kind of prudence that Bush 41 also had about matching ends to means and not overreaching. German reunification, I think, is a good example. I mean, it is truly remarkable if you look at history that within a year of the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany was reunified. It was something that few people anticipated would happen, and certainly happen at that pace at the time. But Bush and Baker and people like Bob Zellick, with whom we both worked, I think understood what the opportunity was, and then worked quite methodically with not only the two Germanys, the Soviets, as the Soviet Union was beginning to deteriorate, and our closest European allies, to come up with some, novel concepts and ways of thinking about this process that gave everybody a stake in the process and ultimately in the outcome. So, in hindsight, it does look as if it was foreordained. It certainly didn't look that way at the time. And it was always a reminder to me of, the importance of boldness in leadership and appreciation of that moment that you want to take advantage of, but then matching that with heads down diplomacy and attention to detail, the endless conversations and meetings that it takes to kind of coax people along to the point that you want to get to.
You have a lot of quotes that have stayed with you throughout your career, throughout the book, including some really interesting Baker, Texas quotes like, "Don't make me leave a dead cat at the door," and things like this. I don't know how that translated into different languages.
In Arabic, it didn't always translate as well.
What did it mean, "Don't make me leave a dead cat at your door"?
It was basically, if this process collapses, in this case the Madrid peace process, the effort to get to Madrid, don't make me blame you as the one who's responsible for it. And we had a wonderful Arabic language interpreter in the State Department then, but this was a real challenge because that phrase he struggled with a little bit. Even Texas phrases like "that dog won't hunt" didn't always, on the first time Baker used it, sink in with people. But he was an extraordinarily effective diplomat. And a very tough and skillful negotiator, too.
And, I don't want to delve deeply into the business of diplomacy, but that's what your book is about. And this important role that the interpreters and translators play. There's a famed U.S. interpreter in China who is the only one for a whole slew of terms that are very delicate in trade and things who can do this. And diplomacy reaches to all of those things, right? Is really, how do you get that message right at that moment of negotiation? And there's no feeling like trying to negotiate and somehow you see a different expression than what you were communicating because the translation has, somehow you can tell left a different impression.
No, it's true.
But we have so many good ones. Yeah.
No, it's true in terms of interpreters, and it's, it's a reminder of the significance of language because it's easy to conclude in the 21st century now that diplomacy is somehow less relevant because the digital technology revolution has enabled people to communicate directly between capitals. And so the question always is, why do you need ambassadors? Why do you need embassies? And I've actually been convinced in recent years that, of course, diplomacy has to adapt. And adaptation is not something that comes easily to the State Department. But it is ultimately, diplomacy is ultimately a business of human interactions. So that requires not only a capacity in languages, but it also means you have to have an understanding of history and culture and how to navigate another society in the pursuit of your own country's interests. And that second part is equally important. And, a lot of times I think diplomats, especially because we spend long periods overseas, can lose sight of that a little bit and lose the connection with their own society. But really good diplomats, the core skills, I think, of really good diplomats that haven't changed all that much, over the decades.
Yep. So in the book, some of the, let's say, maybe bad decisions, controversial decisions, or ones that have been questioned, both in your book or by others that you were involved with, include Iraq 2003, the Iran deal, TPP canceling, inadequately confronting China's trade practices and objections to those, the Syria red line, NATO expansion beyond Central Europe, and some of that piece, and what you call the demolition of U.S. diplomacy. But you make the point in the book that it reaches deep and far back. It's not just a new piece, although there's a new iteration of that from your point of view. But I think you cite a 50% cut in the foreign policy budget from the 80s to before 9/11. So a very quick 15 years almost of really decimation of those budgets and investment in those budgets. Any of those you want to touch on before we start with you getting sworn in as a diplomat?
Oh, God.
You've got good pictures here.
I'll filibuster then. No, I mean, I think, I lived through and I shared, a lot of the mistakes that were made over the course of my career. And I try to be honest about it in the book because, there's always a temptation when you write a memoir to write what you wish you had said rather than what you actually did. So I tried to ground this, for better or worse, in what I said and did at the time. I mean, certainly the most painful and complicated period in my checkered diplomatic career was I ran the Middle East Bureau in the State Department for Colin Powell in the first term of George W. Bush's administration. So this is in the run-up to the war in Iraq. And, my colleagues and I, almost to a woman and man in the Near East Bureau of the State Department, had profound misgivings about the direction and the pace at which we were going on Iraq. I remember one of the most depressing brainstorming sessions of my career was the summer of 2002 when two of my colleagues, Ryan Crocker, a wonderful diplomat, and a guy named David Pierce and I sat down and decided we would sort of do a memo for Powell which laid out all the things we thought at least could go wrong, after the toppling of Saddam Hussein, because I don't mean to minimize the military challenge, but I always thought the complicated part would be the day after. And, it ended up being a 14-page single-space memo, which gives you a sense of the scope of this. And we entitled it The Perfect Storm and gave it to Powell, and he drew on the arguments and conversations he was having with the president at the time. And you reread it now, years later, and we got it about half right. There were some things we identified, I think, accurately about the way in which other regional players, whether it was Iran or others, would take advantage of post-Saddam chaos in Iraq, the obvious danger of sectarian conflict breaking out there. But we got a lot of things wrong, too. But it was an honest effort that I think public servants, especially career public servants, have. It's an obligation to speak the truth, at least as you see it, even when it's inconvenient. And I know we'll get to this later, but it's what I admire most about a number of my former colleagues now who are traipsing up to Capitol Hill with their heads held high, and they're being honest about concerns they had at the time and what they said and did. They're doing their jobs. This isn't a deep state. These are people doing their jobs. But that was, the run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003 was the biggest mistake that I was certainly associated with in American foreign policy, and we're living with some of the consequences of that today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now we get to touch a little bit on. Okay. Yeah.
It's my wife, Lisa. We met in the ever romantic entering Foreign Service Officer class through the miracle of alphabetical seating. Her last name is Carty, C-A-R-T-Y, so Burns and Carty were together. This might be history you'd want to add some flourish to. Yeah, that was my line at the time that we were fated. She didn't buy that for some time after that, but my first posting was in Jordan, and then Lisa went to Singapore, and we got married a couple years later.
So you grew up an Army brat,
right.
You moved all over. Somehow you ended up swimming in was it Sadat's pool in Egypt? I don't know. You could tell us that, but. And then you go to Oxford, you're sworn in the day or the week that the U.S. Embassy seized in Tehran.
So I took the written exam for the Foreign Service the day,
in London.
Right, the same week that my future colleagues were taken hostage at the embassy in Tehran, which probably should have been a signal to me about, the virtue of diplomacy. But.
And I think State Department, the words that used to be used was pale, male, and Yale.
Right.
And your wife was sworn in as a diplomat, and you were promptly both sent to different sides of the world which, until Colin Powell came and really focused on how we keep our career diplomat couples together, I don't think much thought was given to accommodating families.
No, it's true. I mean, both things are true. When I came into the Foreign Service at the beginning of 1982, 9 out of 10, professional American diplomats looked like me. They were white. Only 1 out of 4 were women, like my future wife, Lisa. We made painfully slow progress in the following 4 decades to try to create a diplomatic service that looks more like the society we represent. Because I've always found in my own experience overseas, you get a lot farther through the power of your example than you do through the power of your preaching as well. But so the Foreign Service has evolved in a lot of ways over that period of time. It's complicated with 2 career couples, as it is in any profession, but in the Foreign Service. And the honest answer is Lisa ended up making more sacrifices than I did. We raised 2 wonderful daughters, and we were very fortunate compared to most people of our generation. The longest separation we had was 7 months. And these days, you find couples who are separated for, 3, 4, 5 years sometimes, which is really, really tough.
I want to probe this quote I have from one of the people you studied under when you were getting your doctorate in international relations at St. John's College at Oxford, so Hedley Bull. And because I've heard this often in my diplomatic work, quote, Americans tend to be impatient of imperfections and are convinced that every problem has a solution. This is so true. There's nothing wrong with that, but diplomacy is more often about managing problems and solving them. How do you feel about that after?
Well, I think it's something where there's an awful lot of truth in that comment. There's nothing wrong with the instinct to solve problems, and every once in a while, Dayton was a good example of that, you can. But those moments are rare enough, when the opportunity can be combined with really skillful diplomacy. More often than not, you're managing problems, or you're trying to deal with them in stages. That's what I always thought, at least the Iranian nuclear negotiations were about. I would love to have been able to do, I'm sure President Obama would have too, a comprehensive deal which settled all of the many tensions between us and the Iranian regime. But I was convinced that, you had to approach this step by step, much as we did with many of our differences with the Soviet Union, which was, a much bigger order threat and rival to the United States. And so, on the nuclear issue, that meant trying to limit at least one of the most imminent dangers, and then, like any arms control process, building on it over time. The agreement that, John Kerry deserves enormous credit for negotiating in the summer of 2015 was meant to be the beginning of diplomacy, not the end of it.
Okay, now we get another picture. So I think that's George Shultz and President Reagan, and I think you are seated here. Yeah. Right. So, okay, George Shultz really, when you enter U.S. diplomacy, when I did, he was the tending the garden man.
Right.
So talk a little bit about that. I think you managed to quote Vince Lombardi, Woody Allen, but Woody Allen comes into this chapter, 90% of life is showing up, and you showed up at a lot of interesting places, even starting then. Yeah,
I was really lucky. I worked at the NSC staff in the late 1980s, so the last 3 years of the Reagan administration, arriving actually 2 months before the Iran-Contra scandal broke, so my sense of timing was always just great. This was a discussion, I think it was December of 1988, so the very end of the Reagan administration, and this was a discussion about beginning a direct dialogue with Yasser Arafat's PLO. Shultz had said, and Reagan had supported, some very strict conditions that Arafat had to meet to open up that conversation. And Arafat, true to form, had tested whether he could, do 2/3 of the things we wanted and still pull off the dialogue. And Shultz, quite rightly, had been very tough about that. So this was the meeting, as I recall it, in which the president approved the beginning of the dialogue because Arafat had actually met the conditions.
Do you think Arafat, how will he be viewed looking back at history? This was before really Hamas became a power, and Hezbollah and ISIS and all of this. Do you think he'll be viewed differently?
No, I think, it's one thing, it's how Arafat is viewed by Palestinians as much as how he's viewed by Israelis or people outside Israel and Palestine. I always thought Arafat, missed some quite significant opportunities. So did a number of Israeli leaders too. But Arafat, in my experience, was always most comfortable playing the victim and, as a revolutionary. I remember seeing him during the second Intifada, the violence that broke out after 2001 in the West Bank, in particular the West Bank and Gaza, which is really ugly to witness, both in terms of the Israeli life that was lost as well as the Palestinian life that was lost. But you'd go in and see Arafat in this bunker he had called the Muqata in Ramallah, which was the Palestinian capital. And, everybody else is on edge because of the pressures and the military conflict, and the economy was falling apart. And Arafat looked like he was the most comfortable person in the room. He would always try to put his machine pistol, before the photographers came in, on the table in front of him when you were meeting him, just to show that he was a revolutionary. So I would always try to gently move it to the chair when the photographers came in. But he was, in my opinion anyway, he was, and I'm not trying to absolve anybody, Israeli leaders, American leaders, anybody else, because we all missed opportunities. He found it extremely difficult to take that big leap that would have been required, I think, to get to a two-state solution, and in effect to call the bluff of a lot of Israeli leaders about what was possible.
Mm-hmm. I think we moved to another administration here.
Yeah.
So
this is the Madrid Peace Conference.
So this is Madrid. One thing that strikes me is you are taken under the wing, if you will, of two extraordinary people, Colin Powell and Dennis Ross, another legend in the world of diplomacy. And you're promoted, and I've never read a book where someone's arguing that they shouldn't have been promoted, they didn't have enough experience, but you felt you were being promoted too quickly.
Yeah, it was sort of a novel thought, at least in the State Department. But I remember Colin Powell one time, toward the end of the Reagan administration, had asked if I would become the head of the Middle East office there. I was 31 years old, I think 32, and so I dutifully went over to his office with a list of people I thought were more qualified and started to try to talk him out of it. And as is his wont, he's a really wonderful leader. He just stopped me and said, I wouldn't have asked you to do this if I didn't think you could do it. So I immediately got that signal and, did the diplomatic equivalent of saluting and marched out of the office. And, you couldn't help but feel more self-assured if, someone like that thought that you could do a job too. But I was always very conscious. I was very fortunate at the pace I moved in my career, but I was always very conscious of trying to do it right. I had learned Arabic before I came in the Foreign Service, but I spent almost 2 years studying Russian before going to Moscow the first time because, you need to do that right. It's hard to be an effective diplomat there unless you have, really good command of the language.
Yeah. One thing that struck me in the book, there's a lot to say about this conference and how extraordinary this was and what it symbolized. You also take a sub part of this, which was Jim Baker being in Moscow with Shevardnadze. I think they were in Moscow,
right,
and getting the Russians to agree to a joint announcement condemning Saddam Hussein for invading Kuwait. And you call that in your book the true end of the Cold War.
In many ways it was. Baker was actually, he was in...
Or the symbol of the end.
Yeah, he was actually in Mongolia of all places. He had gone for a visit, and then he had been persuaded that it wouldn't be a good idea for the American Secretary of State to actually shoot Mongolian sheep. So he was actually photographing them, which was...
There was a plan for him to shoot them?
Well, no, he's a big hunter, and so
okay.
that's what he was going to do. Anyway, so then the news of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait came, and Baker very quickly, I think, appreciated the moment, flew to Moscow, met with Shevardnadze, issued a statement, which in many ways really did mark the end of the Cold War, I think, a joint U.S.-Soviet statement condemning Saddam's invasion, which even a few years before would have been yet another opportunity, I think, for competition, if not confrontation, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Yeah, extraordinary moment. I'm going to dig into one thing because when you enter the U.S. government, if you're involved with diplomacy, there's a saying that happens sometimes, which is don't have an April Glaspie moment. What is meant by that, but you defend our ambassador to Iraq in the book, I think. I mean, you mentioned this incident. This was the U.S. ambassador to Iraq who visits with Saddam Hussein and writes back to Washington saying that, had communicated to him on, I don't think she was freelancing, but telling him that we have no opinion on your Arab-to-Arab conflicts, including any dispute you have with Kuwait. That's widely viewed as sending a signal that all hell will break loose if you move those troops that are all piled up on the border there. Tell me about your defense here and why you think that's a wrong, or have I misread what you say?
No, I mean, April Glaspie was a wonderful diplomat in a really unfortunate position. And, there was another half to what she said to Saddam, which was, and this was the American policy at the time, that we didn't take a particular position on disputes over territory. In this case, it was between Iraq and Kuwait. We did, however, and she said this at the time, take a position on how those disputes got resolved. They needed to be resolved peacefully, not through the use of force. I think Saddam heard what he wanted to hear, more the first half of that statement than the second. But, what she said was actually not far off of what American policy was at the time and, what we were communicating to the Iraqis then. So, I always thought it was unfair that she got hung out to dry over that.
But it points to the importance of words. Words matter, and clear communication. And I think a lot of confusion in the world today about exactly, like, when I travel in the world, people want to know exactly what does the U.S. want, like precisely, because it's a dangerous world. And so do you think in general, well, obviously you think social media hasn't been a blessing to diplomacy, but
it's a reality, yeah.
So how do we manage in a world where those cues are very important? Literally, nations rise and fall, people die or not based on accurate reading of those.
Yeah, and what you say. And it's hard, for Americans, we're always generally a kind of impatient society. And, because of America's role in the world, there's generally more pressure to say or do something about everything that happens in the world. Sometimes the best thing to do is take a deep breath and not say or do something. But, we have to live with those kind of pressures as well. And, especially in the current era, when too much of policy, I think, gets driven tweet to tweet without the benefit of, at least taking into account expertise and, people's sense of what words are going to be the biggest landmines in the minefield. You can end up stumbling into some pretty significant problems.
Well, German reunification is going to get 2 seconds here. This is an impossible interview because we've only been through 2 pictures. I got many, and we're going to get to the audience in 12 minutes. No, it's my fault.
The thing, if you look at Gorbachev is sitting there just to the left of President Bush, and his, the Soviet Union would collapse within 2 months of that picture. So if he looks a little distracted, then there was a reason for it.
Yeah. So just to quote Baker at that time, because you've just made this point, but you have this in the book, the most important test of leadership is to not do something, even if it looks really damn easy. Overreaching is what gets people into trouble. Jack Wadsworth is a famed negotiator in another field, but I don't think you're used to overreaching. I think it's an important point for anyone who's negotiating anything. But.
Yeah, and this was Baker describing the decision in the very brief war in Desert Storm, which expelled, Saddam's forces from Kuwait when they were fleeing headlong back to Baghdad. And it would have been, in some ways, the easiest thing in the world militarily to keep right on going after them and bring Saddam down. I think Bush and Baker and Scowcroft made what was, in my view then and still is, the right decision, which was not to do that, which was hard in a way to do. But they understood, I think, that they would then own the aftermath of Saddam Hussein, something which 10 years later we didn't pay so much attention to. Second, that it would likely break up this big coalition that we had put together, which was premised on expelling the Iraqis from Kuwait, not changing the regime in Baghdad as well. And, even then they saw a broader stake here, with the end of the Cold War, that you wanted to hold that coalition of countries together, not just to get to the Madrid Peace Conference, but also to begin to try to lay the basis of a post-Cold War order.
So we're going to get 30 seconds now for each important moment in history here. So here...
that's our daughters, yeah, with Madeleine Albright.
So Madeleine Albright, so the Clinton era, you're in charge of policy planning at State. Tom Friedman had said Baker, at the time... Yeah. Oh, that's under Baker?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's not delve into that because I think we need to move now to this era, which was really the era of Russia and NATO and expansion, and I think many new challenges.
Yeah, it was in the 90s. I mean, here was an era of uncontested American primacy. It was, an administration for President Clinton, especially in his first term, who was understandably focused on a lot of domestic issues. But here we had in the Balkans, for example, a huge mess developing. The European countries had proven largely incapable of handling this on their own. It's actually, as much admiration as I have for Bush and Baker, it's a fair criticism of all of us at the end of the Bush 41 administration that there wasn't enough focus on what was happening after the breakup of Yugoslavia. So, and then you had, of course, Russia, Yeltsin's Russia, emerging out of the wreckage of the Soviet Union, which, involved a really kind of curious mix of hope, the end of communism on the part of a lot of Russians, but also a sense of humiliation, that their position as the peer of the United States was gone. And I served in the embassy in Moscow the first time as the head of the political section in the early mid-90s. And I've always felt, if you want to understand the smoldering aggressiveness of Vladimir Putin's Russia, it helps to have understood what Russia was like in the 90s when it was flat on its back. The economy had collapsed. And, I remember traveling in the first Chechen war, Chechnya is, in southern Russia, and a separatist struggle broke out there in the early 1990s. And I'd never seen anything quite like it. I remember traveling to the Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in the winter of 1994-95. And, you're driving in through this kind of, shattered landscape. There were 40 square blocks in the center of Grozny had been leveled. It looked like pictures of Dresden, 1945, that you see.
Or Syria today.
Or Syria today, you're right. But driving in, here was the remnants of the Red Army that at the height of the Cold War was supposed to be able to get to the English Channel in 48 hours that looked like a street gang. Now, albeit a nuclear armed street gang. But, it was a bunch of conscripts who were underfed, poorly led, who were scared. Yeah. And so it was a reminder of how far Russia had fallen in a sense. And of course, when Putin, who's now been Russia's leader for 20 years, was determined to right that balance. I mean, in a sense, I've always thought of Putin as kind of an apostle of payback. He was determined to push back against what he thought was a Western effort to take advantage of Russia's moment of historical weakness.
Oh, and he still has that mission.
Right. No, that's what animates him.
So George Kennan called, I think, that rapid expansion or the effort to rapidly expand it the most fateful era of American foreign policy during the Cold War, our post-Cold War period. I think we had some key players, Richard Holbrooke, Strobe Talbot, you, Tony Lake, and others really having at it.
I was a much more junior player. No, I mean, I always thought the first couple of waves of NATO expansion, the first instance in the mid-late 1990s that included Central and East European states, and then the next wave, big wave, which brought in the Baltic states, you could argue over the pace, but ultimately it struck me as being a sensible set of choices. I was sitting in the embassy in Moscow in the early 90s, so, naturally we tried to highlight the fact that you needed to take Russian sensibilities into account, because sooner or later Russia was going to be in a position to push back. But none of that, in my view, was an argument against NATO expansion in those first two phases. Where I do think that we probably overreached was in the spring of 2008. I had returned to Moscow as the ambassador, when we pushed very hard at the end of the George W. Bush administration to open the door formally to NATO membership for Ukraine and also Georgia. And I just think, at best you could say that was premature because I hate to use the term red line, but it crossed the reddest of red lines, not just for Putin, but for most people I knew across the Russian political elite, even some of his most progressive critics. And so, he was bound to push back. And I just think it was a moment when it wasn't right to push in that direction. So I think that was a mistake, at least in that period.
And I know it's impossible to kind of go back and rewrite history, but do you think it was possible that Russia could have been westward leaning and come out of that experience post-Cold War with a very different set of alliances or friendships than we see today?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a historical determinist, so I don't assume that we were doomed to confrontation with one another of the sort that we've seen, especially since the Ukraine crisis and Russia's aggression against Ukraine in 2014. I do think that, looking back on the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, that it would have been really hard to avoid some level of tension between Russia and the United States and the West, simply because we both had illusions. The United States, we tended to assume through different administrations that ultimately the Russians would get comfortable with the idea of being the junior partner of the United States, because they didn't really have a good alternative in the view of lots of people in Washington. And, Russians, both in Yeltsin's time and in Putin's time, had a different kind of illusion that they could have a peer relationship with the United States when the geopolitical realities just wouldn't back that up. And so the net result, I think, was to create a certain amount of friction and competition over time. It didn't have to be, in my view, the kind of outright aggression and confrontation that we've seen in recent years. But, Vladimir Putin is a combustible combination of, grievance and ambition and insecurity all wrapped together. And so, it's very hard for me to anticipate a future in U.S.-Russian relations, at least in relations with Putin's Russia, that's anything beyond a kind of narrow band of possibilities between the sharply competitive and the nastily adversarial. Now, how you manage that is the real test of statecraft and diplomacy, because we've kind of gotten out of practice in managing complicated great power relationships, and you do want to preserve a safety net in those relationships. So the old arms control architecture that goes back to the Soviet period is about to collapse. The last remaining remnant of that is the New START agreement, which regulates and reduces and monitors strategic nuclear weapons. It makes all the sense in the world to try to extend that agreement, which expires in about a year. But there's no effort right now that's visible to try to do that. And I think we'll all pay a price for that if we don't pay attention to preserving at least something of a safety net in a very competitive relationship.
Okay, we're racing through history here. We now have Bush 43, his team. You were Assistant Secretary for Near Asian Affairs, put together a hell of a team there that was quite famed. And I think one of your hallmarks was surrounding yourself with people that you said were smarter than you, and you really attracted the best. I think you wrote a memo then warning not of Desert Storm, but of the perfect storm that could happen. We touched on the Iraq War.
Yeah, I mean, this is, you see Secretary Rumsfeld here, the most pitched battles that I ever saw in Washington, at least, amongst the different agencies were in this era, especially between Secretary Rumsfeld's Pentagon and the State Department at the time. We oftentimes, spent more time arguing and combating one another than we did people in the Middle East. And it's not, I learned a lot of lessons in that period about how not to run governments.
Yep. So, here we have you with Condi Rice and Elliot Abrams. She approached you to be ambassador to Israel. You ended up being ambassador to Russia. You called it, I think, your dream job. What dreams were you fulfilling with that?
It had more to do with, for my generation of diplomats, sort of at the height of the Cold War, working in Moscow, always had a certain allure, but you're right, it's kind of sick to think of that as your dream job if you look at. But Secretary Rice was, herself a Russia Soviet specialist. She speaks good Russian. And I remember one story when I was ambassador in Moscow, this would have been like the fall of 2006, and so Condi Rice, the Secretary of State, comes to visit. We go out to see Putin at his dacha, which is actually a pretty palatial house out in the forest beyond Moscow. and he preferred to do meetings there rather than the Kremlin. So first we had dinner, then we move into this room with this roaring fireplace. So it's just Secretary Rice and me and Putin and Sergei Lavrov, who was and is the foreign minister. It was a pretty desultory conversation. We were talking about trade differences and all the things we wrestled with in that era, until Secretary Rice very, quietly but firmly raised Georgia and tensions between Georgia and Russia, and emphasized the importance of Russian restraint. And this got a rise out of Vladimir Putin, and I remember him standing up in front of the fireplace, and he rarely got very red in the face or animated. He did on that occasion. And he basically was arguing that, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was then the president of Georgia, is your puppet, your American puppet. You just need to pull back on the reins or there's going to be trouble. And was wagging his finger in her face. And of course, then Secretary Rice stood up, and she had heels on, and in which she was about 5'11", Putin's about 5'6", even with lifts in his shoes. And this did not improve his disposition. So she held her own, though. But it was this was 2006, it was, an early reminder, in a sense, of the tensions which would then spill over when Putin invaded Georgia in August of 2008, and ultimately the tensions that would spill over with Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2014.
I'm going to take advantage of the ambassador from Kazakhstan being here and Kazakhstan's decision to denuclearize. Amazing decision. I don't think it gets enough credit historically.
It's true.
And your concern that in arms control we're entering an era where those limits are coming off and those agreements are expiring and they're not going to be renewed. Your father also had a career in arms control and held a significant position in that. Just talk about that, touch on that.
Well, arms control, as I said before, first I think Kazakhstan deserves enormous credit for the example that it set in the early mid-1990s in agreeing to denuclearize. It's a rare demonstration of leadership and statesmanship. And since then, Kazakhstan has played a really important role on non-proliferation issues. In other words, using the fine example that it set on the Iran nuclear issue and other ones as well, which has been, I think, a really valuable contribution. And when
I was at State, amazing record on fighting anti-Semitism. This is like setting a tone of tolerance, which, I don't think these stories quite get told.
No, I agree with you. But I do worry that not only is the sort of what's left of the U.S.-Russia edifice or architecture of arms control in danger of collapsing, but a lot of the other big non-proliferation issues out there, whether it's North Korea or Iran, we're kind of stuck right now. On Iran, I won't belabor it, but I think it was an incredibly foolish decision for the United States last May of 2018, to bail out of the comprehensive nuclear agreement. And I worry that on the North Korean nuclear issue, that I've never been a critic of President Trump's, kind of unorthodox decision to start that diplomacy at the top and meet now 3 times with Kim Jong-un. It's not like, me or anybody else involved in diplomacy the last 30 or 40 years could point to a pristine record of dealing with North Korea on the nuclear missile issues. So it's worth a try. The problem, however, I think, is that, Kim Jong-un, in my view, has no intention in the foreseeable future of fully denuclearizing, because he thinks his current nuclear arsenal is too central to his security, to his stature, to his survival. And no amount of love letters or summit meetings, I think, is going to change that in the short run. So the question is, and this, given the irony of what I'm about to say, may seem strange, but it's worth taking a page from the book of our negotiations with the Iranians and looking at interim steps that you could take that preserve the aspiration of full denuclearization, which is important to do, but help to create a more stable, reduced, more heavily monitored nuclear program in the meantime. That's easier said than done. I think negotiating with the North Koreans on the nuclear issue would make people nostalgic for negotiating with the Iranians, especially on verification issues, because it's a very, very tough set of issues to push with the North Koreans. But that's another example of my growing concern about where we are in non-proliferation.
So we're going to get back to Iran in just a second, and we're going to get to the audience in 3 seconds, or a little bit more. But as you know, this institution played an important role under Tom Pickering and others on the track 2 with Iran for many years. And I'm sure you'll be asked questions on it. One of them that came up early was this lack of inclusion of Iran's broader ambitions in the region, and how that has been, is viewed as quite destabilizing to U.S. friends throughout the Middle East and the Gulf. So we'll get back to that and why that happened. And okay, so we're going to go through 4 of these all at once. So first we have you, I think, in the Situation Room. Yeah.
No, that's in Putin's office. Yeah. Okay, I'm missing one here. You tell us what they are. Yes. Yeah.
Because I can't quite see.
Yeah, this is when I was ambassador meeting with Putin, who was more accessible then. I mean, I wouldn't try to suggest it was a great pleasure to spend time talking to him, but I didn't abuse it. But you could get in to see him if you needed to.
What don't we know about his personality that you know?
As I said before, he is a kind of apostle of payback. I mean, he is a control...
Sounds like a James Bond movie.
Yeah, maybe it could be. I don't know. But he's a control freak in the sense that he's deeply mistrustful of his own political elite and his own population, I think, as well. And, he, like this, given the history of Russia in the last 30 years, he has a big chip on his shoulder, too. I vividly remember the first meeting I had with Putin as the newly arrived American ambassador in August of 2005. So meeting takes place in the Kremlin, which is, those of you who have been there know, is built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So you go walking down these long corridors through these huge ornate halls. You come to the end of one huge hall, and there are these 2-story bronze doors. You're kept waiting there for a few minutes just to let all this sink in. Then the door opens a crack, and out comes Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is, not all that intimidating in the flesh. He carries himself with great self-assurance. So he comes walking through the door. Before I got a word out of my mouth, says in Russian, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore."
That's his hello.
Right. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms. In my experience, that was vintage Vladimir Putin. It was not subtle. It was almost defiantly charmless. But the message was quite clear, and that's what we've been dealing with, and we'll continue to.
Let's see what we have here. Okay, this is the Bin Laden. So right after the Bin Laden raid.
It was before the raid.
That's the Situation Room.
Yeah. That is, and President Obama and a variety of the rest of us, yeah.
So we'll just, unless you want to jump right in. Okay, you're being sworn in only the second career Foreign Service officer in our history to become Deputy Secretary of State.
They won't make that mistake again. And my wife.
I remember that moment, and your wife and your daughters are there.
Now more grown up.
Okay, we have you in the Oval Office.
This was President Obama calling President Mubarak of Egypt 4 days before he was toppled. And this was an effort to persuade him to step down, which he didn't take too kindly.
So some in the region feel, I just went and saw Hamilton again and all about in the room where it happened. And that moment sent a signal throughout the region of the U.S. upending the entire region.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think especially you talk to our friends in the Gulf and, their view oftentimes, especially at the time, but still powerfully felt today, is that we, the Americans, threw Hosni Mubarak under the bus. My own experience is that, the political bus at least was halfway across his prone body before President Obama pronounced himself, in the sense that, President Mubarak, after many years in power, responded with too little too late to some building pressures in his own society. And I think there's a natural tendency in the Arab world and many other parts of the world to assume too much about American agency. There's also a tendency in Washington to assume too much about that too. But I think in this instance, I honestly, having lived through this, don't think that President Obama could have played his cards much differently than we did. It was obviously in our interest, and we thought in Egypt's, for there be an orderly transfer of power, but that's much easier said than done.
Okay, and Arab Spring, let's get into that. I hope one of you ask about it, because when a street vendor in Tunisia can set fire to a region whose aspirations were not being addressed, right? It really signaled a new era, and I think we still see that playing out
and they're
today,
brittle, and it's and they're brittle societies as well, where there was, people felt an absence of dignity more than anything else.
I think speaking of Syria.
Yeah. This is with Bashar al-Assad. I don't know. The New York
That's
Times.
all you get to say on that, but we will talk more about it.
These are all, you can see I really associated with a finer class of people. This is with the Iranians. In the summer of 2008, this is the first time we actually joined our European, Russian, and Chinese negotiating partners at the table with the Iranians.
And we have 4 of these.
Yeah, this is before we started the secret talks with the Iranians. And that's that same thing in Geneva.
And then with Kerry, I think we have. Okay, this brings us to the end of the photo show. And we're going to go to the audience now, but please, let's, on a lighter note of the savory characters you hung around with, you were telling me of one of your weirdest moments, which was a session with Muammar Qaddafi.
Yeah, Muammar Qaddafi was by far the most peculiar foreign leader I ever dealt with, and I sort of 2 vignettes, I guess. We were involved in another set of back channel or secret talks with the Libyans just after 9/11, so between 2001 2003, to persuade Qaddafi to get out of the business of terrorism, to take responsibility and pay compensation to the families of the victims of the Lockerbie attack, when Qaddafi's agents had been responsible for shooting down or bringing down a Pan Am airline, killed 270 people on the plane and on the ground in Scotland, and then to give up what was a rudimentary nuclear program. So I spent a lot of time going back and forth to Libya quietly, among other things, talking to Qaddafi. So the 2 vignettes. Qaddafi's favorite time to meet was usually about 3 o'clock in the morning, which was not my prime time. And on one occasion, I remember meeting way out in the middle of the Libyan desert in this old army tent furnished with, not ornately white plastic lawn furniture. And so Qaddafi and I are sitting there. The conversation goes on for 3 or 4 hours. He took a while to warm up, and but he had this really strange habit of pausing for 3 or 4 minutes in mid-conversation. He'd just stare at the ceiling, presumably to collect his thoughts, but as a diplomat, I'm trained to carry on conversation, so this is a little awkward. What made the time worth passing is that he, on this occasion, was wearing what you could only describe as a yellow pajama top with photographs of dead African dictators on it. So every time he would stare at the ceiling, I would try to figure out how many of them I could identify. And I got pretty good by the end of 4 hours. The other very brief Qaddafi story took place here in New York almost 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, UN General Assembly. Leaders come, as you know, they're all supposed to speak for no more than 8 or 10 minutes. Qaddafi on this occasion spoke for 90 minutes. He had no prepared text. He had scraps of paper that kept falling off the podium. But what I remember most vividly, speaking of interpreters, the UN had a wonderful Arabic language interpreter. So as this monologue is going on, I'm listening to the Arabic to English interpretation. 75 minutes into the 90-minute monologue, you hear in Arabic, "I can't take this anymore." He throws off his headphones, and so if you didn't speak Arabic the last 15 minutes, you were out of luck. But you didn't miss much. So that was Qaddafi.
So we have questions coming from online, but I'm going to go to our audience first and make sure we start including you. And please identify yourselves and
I'm Long Island University.
Hi.
Questions, please, not monologues.
Personal diplomacy seems to be very important in the State Department. Like Roosevelt and Churchill had a very good relationship. Is that true for every level of the State Department, or is it just the top leaders?
No, it's pretty much true. Even as the most junior diplomat, you're trying to build relationships, not just with counterparts in governments. One of the big changes the last couple of generations, in my experience, has been, diplomacy is not just about government-to-government relations. It's also about trying to explain yourself in other societies and connecting to people across those societies too. But at the end of the day, that's very much personal. It depends on building those relationships and trying to use them to better understand how to navigate that terrain.
Yeah, I was just struck by the Tehran conference that led to the decision to open a second front and ultimately Normandy and D-Day. And Roosevelt travels, 7 hours, and it ends up killing him in the end, right? Going to Yalta and there, but that devotion. I mean, it takes in the end individuals moving this. Cynthia Polsky.
Hi.
So we're in a moment that's
Could you put the mic close?
We're in a moment that's very far from Bush 1 and the wonderful interlock of people who are homogeneous with each other, very well educated, very strategic, very admirable.
Yep.
And now we are in the wild out there. We have women, people of color. Everyone is wanting and trying to have a place in the conversation, participate, and we have above all the new technology that makes it possible to be disruptive every minute, every second, not just out of our own sector, but out of any and every sector. So how do you imagine your very wonderful and proper sense of how diplomacy can and should operate, the wonderful world of building relationships and carrying on conversations, all undercut by what we know happens right now as we're speaking?
Well, I mean, I think first is self-criticism, and I think the State Department as an institution, and I was a part of it for a long time, needs to be honest about the fact that we need to adopt a little bit as well. I mean, there are individual career diplomats who can be incredibly courageous and resourceful and resilient. As an institution, however, the State Department is rarely accused of being too agile or too full of initiative. And so, there are things the State Department needs to do. It's become a too top-heavy an institution. We've worked our way to the beginning of the 21st century in technology, but we've got a long way to go. That's the way in which you modernize diplomacy, taking into account the reality that personal relationships still matter enormously, but it just enables you to communicate and operate better. But you also have to respect the reality that diplomacy matters more than ever, I think, in promoting American interests on today's international landscape. I talked before about plastic moments, 1945, 1989. We're in another one of those plastic moments right now. We were hugely lucky in a way, or fortunate, in 1945 and 1989 that intersected with groups of statesmen who understood what was at stake and understood the opportunity. You don't see that kind of statesmanship right now, out of the current White House, I don't think. And you certainly see disruptive use of technology, but it's not harnessed to the kind of expertise that you don't always have to heed or pay attention to. It's not like career diplomats have a monopoly on wisdom, but you do want to take it into account, when you're making choices as well, especially when what you're dealing with are not just shifts in the balance of power among states with the rise of China, but huge challenges, whether it's climate or the revolution in technology or the migration of peoples at record levels around the world today. Challenges that go beyond the capacity of any one state to deal with. Diplomacy ought to be our tool to try to come to grips, to mobilize coalitions of countries to deal with those challenges, because it's that capacity to invest in alliances and mobilize coalitions which sets us apart today from lonelier powers like China and Russia. Diplomacy ought to be our tool of first resort to take advantage of that, but I'm afraid we're corroding that pretty badly right now.
One thing I worry about is the era after World War II, when the U.S. invested a lot of muscle and treasure to create a new vision of a world of open sea lanes and openness and sharing, and the world kind of bought into this. And, it is beyond Trump. The U.S. is tired. It's invested a lot of money in that. Is the era of Pax Americana over? And we don't see any nations volunteering to step up to the plate. We have a number of people who are here from the United Nations. I mean, those budgets are being slashed and everyone's facing cuts. And all of that building up of a different kind of order You travel to the heartland of America, and I don't know how in it this nation is for another round.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say two things. One about the international, or one about the kind of domestic disconnect today. I think you're right. There is a real disconnect, in a way, between people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington establishment, and lots of American citizens who, when we preach the virtues of disciplined American leadership in the world, don't really need to be persuaded about the significance of American engagement in the world to protect our security and our prosperity, but they're more skeptical about the discipline part because they've seen administrations of both parties not match ends to means. And so we have to be honest about the need, whomever sitting in the White House, not to fan the flames of that disconnect, but actually to try to bridge it a little bit more too. And that's not going to be an easy task. On the international landscape, I think what is true is that the era of uncontested American primacy, what we enjoyed for at least the first quarter century after the end of the Cold War, is over. But as I said before, I still think, and I don't mean this as a statement of American arrogance, that we have a better hand to play than any of our major rivals today. The question is how we play it on a world in which still, I think, needs disciplined American leadership, but it's the kind of leadership that's going to be aimed at investing in, strengthening, adapting alliances, mobilizing coalitions, trying to adapt and update a lot of the institutions which have grown up over the last 7 decades, but, need to be refitted to the world of 2019 and beyond, not just the world of 1945 or 1989 even.
Right. Who wants to jump in? Question right here. Gentlemen. That's you. Me? Yeah. And then Lulu Wong, and then...
Hi.
Thank you for your service.
Thanks.
If the pace and scope of NATO expansion was, in retrospect, a mistake, I'm wondering if you think there are analogs today in the manner in which we're conducting our relations with China, albeit not anywhere as weak as Russia was at the time. Are there mistakes that we're making along the way now?
And again, on the NATO expansion issue, to be clear, I mean, where I thought we made a tactical mistake, and this was debated at the time, was in 2008, pushing to open the door formally at that time for Ukrainian and Georgian membership. I'm not taking issue with the first 2 big waves of NATO expansion, which, you had states like Poland, given its history, who had an understandable urge to be anchored, having been caught for so many centuries between the ambitions of Germany and Russia. I think with China, I mean, there are many people in this audience who know China and know the U.S.-China relationship better than I do. My concern today is that, the same kind of lazy fatalism that probably did cause us to assume too much about the benefits of engagement with China for 30 years after the end of the Cold War, that same lazy fatalism can cause us to assume too much about the wisdom of containment or, the workability of decoupling our economies, both of which are fashionable terms in Washington today. U.S.-China rivalry is going to be the central geopolitical reality far out as I can see into the 21st century. History's full of collisions between rising powers and established ones. If we're honest with ourselves, that's certainly a possibility in U.S.-China relations. I don't think it's foreordained. Again, that's the challenge of diplomacy and statecraft. And so there again, I'll return to my, theme of working with others, which is what diplomacy is about. I think President Trump's right to push back against predatory Chinese trade and investment practices. But logically, our tactics ought to build on the fact that there are lots of other players who share those same concerns, the European Union, Japan, just to cite 2. So instead of trying to make common cause with them, which is really the way to shape the incentives and disincentives of the Chinese leadership, we launched second and third front trade conflicts with them over steel and aluminum. So, as is true with a number of the issues that you see in the headlines with the current administration, I think, Trump reads the mood of the American population on foreign policy and entanglements. I think some of his instincts pushing back against Chinese economic practices, pushing some of our NATO allies to spend more on defense, makes sense. But how you go about doing that is crucially important, and that's where I disagree.
Lulu Wang, the Global Vice Chair of Asia Society.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you for your discussion, Ambassador. Actually,
Pleasure.
my question is very much related to the question of the gentleman before me, is that when you were characterizing the challenge to U.S.-Russia relations, because Putin had particular sensibilities and resentments from the past, and that chip on the shoulder problem, it strikes me that's very much the problem we have now with President Xi, who also harkens back to the humiliation of China from its great years of great power. So given the fact that we've learned a bit from, we hope we've learned from the U.S.-Russian problems, can we better address the sensitivities and the aspirations of the Chinese and their president, and be able to work with the sensitivities at the same time that we try to work a better balance in trade and in geopolitics between the two countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think taking into account sensibilities, especially not just of an individual leader, but of a society as big and important as China is obviously crucial in diplomacy. Now, again, I talked before about strategic empathy. It's not the same as sympathy. There are going to be lots of issues on which we and the current Chinese leadership are going to fundamentally disagree. And we're going to have to learn to not only manage those frictions and tensions, which is ultimately what diplomacy is about, but, oftentimes push back hard in areas where we're concerned. But I do think, as I said before, that it's not foreordained that we're headed to, yet another great power conflict. I think there's a way of managing this, difficult as it is, and I hope very much that you see enough wisdom on both sides to be able to try and do that anyway.
Let me see how many questions we have here. So we're going to take 3 in a row because we're winding up here. We'll go here first to Katya Martin, who's, I don't know if I can reveal your upcoming work. So is doing a definitive work on Angela Merkel, who you probably have a lot to say.
Great. I look forward
Not
to
sure
it.
it will be definitive, but
Well,
I'm
it will
working
be
hard.
given the lack of other works
I'll look
of
forward
the
to it
kind.
anyway.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for your wonderful book and your remarks this evening. 2 quick questions.
Sure.
One, I saw that the current Secretary of State took a good, clean shot at you a few days ago, and I wondered and accused you of auditioning to be Secretary of State under a
Right.
Warren administration. Can you deal? Can you deal for a minute?
Let's get that
with-
one answered right away.
Yes. Let's start that go. No, say a few words about morale in the State
Sure.
Department. You mentioned your respect for the colleagues that have the courage
Yes.
to, despite being discouraged from testifying, are testifying. So morale, how do you carry on
Yes.
with the job of diplomacy under present circumstances, and with a Secretary of State who doesn't seem to be supporting his own foreign service officers? And who represents America in the Middle East now that Putin and secondarily Erdogan and tragically Assad are really setting the table? What does that do to our interests in the Middle East? So 2 easy questions.
And let me sneak in and what is the implications of what we now are doing with the Kurds to signals around the world, because we know these send signals.
Yeah, I mean, on the Middle East part first, and I'll get to the State Department, and I'll try to be brief. On the Middle East, I mean, I think what's happened over the last few weeks, and here I acknowledge the remarkable action that took place against Abu Bakr Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, which is a reminder of the incredible competence of the American special operators and intelligence community. But I think the president's impulsive decision in his telephone conversation with Erdogan to pull U.S. forces out of Syria, this was a pretty modest force to start with, is not only a betrayal of the Kurds who had bled, for us in the fight against ISIS, and bled in their own self-interest, but lost something like 11,000, of their fighters who were killed, is also a betrayal of common sense in a way, because it was always going to be difficult to sustain indefinitely a U.S. military presence in Syria. It always was true that it only gave us modest leverage, but I've just always thought there's a smart way and a dumb way to manage that, and I think we chose the dumb way by essentially in that one phone call giving away our leverage and then opening the door to a selection of players, as you mentioned, Putin, Erdogan, Assad, and ultimately ISIS, which is what worries me most, because ISIS is now going to try to revive itself out of the very nasty stew of grievance and insecurity that you're going to, I'm afraid, see increasingly in eastern Syria, especially on the part of a lot of local Sunni Arabs who are frustrated and angry about the Assad regime's attempt to reassert itself, who don't trust the Turks, who have a marriage of convenience with the Kurds, but that's always uneasy as well. And that's exactly the circumstance in which ISIS can benefit. So, we have a hard hand to play in the Middle East. I'm not trying to say that any of these issues are easy, but I think the way in which we played that particular hand is only going to increase the chances of conflict. The president says he wants to end the endless wars. It's the right instinct, but I think we're ending up contributing to a situation in which conflict is going to be more likely. On the State Department, I wrote a piece, I don't know if Dan Kurtz-Phelan is here, the wonderful editor at Foreign Affairs, but at his request in Foreign Affairs.
I think he just raised his hands in the back there.
Hi, Dan. Which was an update of a piece I did after my book came out in Foreign Affairs in the spring, which was looking at American diplomacy. And, I wrote in that piece, I think, that I didn't mean it as an elegy for American diplomacy. I meant it as a reminder of the significance. And in this piece 2 weeks ago, I said I was feeling a lot more elegiac than I did then, because I really worry about, the sidelining of career expertise. There are, not to get too Washington and wonky about this, but there are 28 assistant secretary level positions in the Department of State. These are the positions around which, American diplomacy organizes itself in Washington. Of those 28 positions, only one today is held by a Foreign Service officer. There's a higher percentage of political appointees to ambassadorships overseas today than any time in American history. For 20 years, applications to the Foreign Service from young people in the United States have risen every year. There's been almost a 40% drop in the last 3 years. So, these are the ways in which you hollow out an institution. Those are the tangible measures. The intangible measures, I think, are equally challenging. It's intangible in the sense of the president being asked a year and a half ago whether he was concerned about the record number of senior vacancies in the State Department. And he said, not really, because I'm the only one who matters. That's diplomacy as an exercise in narcissism, not the diplomacy I learned working for Bush and Baker many years ago. And then you have the ongoing Ukraine scandal, where it seems to me, even if you just read the summary released by the White House of the conversation between President Trump and President Zelensky, you have a clear case of a situation in which an American president is trying to use the leverage of his office, American national leverage, not in the pursuit of the national interest, but to squeeze a struggling government that we ought to want to strengthen in Ukraine, faced with real threats from Putin's Russia, but instead use that leverage to pursue personal political gain. And, and then to pursue it through what is in effect a kind of shadow foreign policy. What gives me hope, I wrote this in the piece, is the performance of some of my former colleagues who are doing their jobs, demonstrating the dignity not just of diplomatic service, but of public service in general. And it also helps to humanize and bring to life diplomacy. So American citizens, and we'll see more of this when there's public testimony, in the impeachment inquiry, are doing their jobs and willing to speak truth to power, even when it's not only inconvenient to an administration, but it's at some risk to themselves and to their careers and their futures as well. And that's what gives me not only pride in my old institution, but it gives me hope about what's possible, despite the deep hole we're digging for ourselves, to renew diplomacy to meet all the challenges we were talking about before.
Listen, I want to thank you. Unfortunately, we have so many people that want to ask questions. I'm just going to end with a simple question. If you could have dinner with anyone throughout human history, living or dead, who would it be and why?
Oh, God.
Who comes to mind?
But what comes to mind now is I'm a big Washington Nationals fan. The seventh game of the World Series, so Max Scherzer, who's just about to start pitching. So, yeah, I'm too much of a sports fan to see beyond that right now.
I see.
Yeah.
Very good. Join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thanks.